Mr. President of the Council of Ministers and Minister for Foreign Affairs, authorities, members of the panels, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure and an honor for me to welcome you all as President of ISPI at this closing session of the Med Dialogues 2020. This was the 6th edition, and working online restricts our movements, but it does not limit quality. And MED is the main leading platform for dialogue in the wider Mediterranean and for the region. And there was all the speakers were of very high quality. We had 60 sessions in 8 days of live transmission, and we had many international bodies represented, the representatives of the European Union, and important representatives. During a year, many things happen, and therefore there is much to talk about. Safety, security, dialogue, migration, and so on. Issues that are very main and topical issues. Besides these, this year we also have the COVID pandemic, this black swan that has led to great difficulties and to a high number of casualties and problems for all countries, and with major consequences at the economic and social level. So I think that we have managed during this marathon, this virtual marathon, we have shown that in spite of everything, it is possible to delineate the outline of a positive agenda for the Mediterranean region in the post-COVID world. The COVID-19 pandemic may also represent a rebirth. It may be a catalyst for upgrading our activities. And this may be true particularly for the Mediterranean region. Since the Arab Spring, there have been many winters, and we are constantly confronted with major issues, wondering what the best pathways are for forging ahead. And we have discussed mainly 7 points. We've brought these 7 points to the attention of our audience. The first is that of leaving behind the pandemic, not only from this medical standpoint and with regard to the sharing of what is necessary to fight against the pandemic, but we are about to change the cultural presentation, the cultural conditions, and we need to work together, have governments come together and work together. There is a great request for this, and this has 2 main characteristics: greater cohesion in the north amongst the member countries of the European Union, and also greater cooperation with the southern countries. So we need to develop a new framework for security between the 2 sides of the Mediterranean, and paradoxically, COVID can help us forge ahead. And the involvement of civil society is extremely important. We mustn't leave everything in the hands of the government only, but we must work together. Governments with intermediate bodies, companies, non-governmental organizations, cultural institutes, universities, and the schools. All this needs to work together on common projects. Another important point is that of working on an inclusive model for growth. paying attention to local realities, to training that is fully aware of being centered on the employability of the workforce, and a path towards growth that may rely on energy transition. It is clear that if we succeed in doing this in conjunction with the southern shores of the Mediterranean, there will be advantages for both sides. And we must also pay very close attention for our growth in energy. We must take into account the resources, the energy resources. If we establish cohesion and cooperation between the two sides of the Mediterranean, the resources will be able to become drivers for growth. And then migrations. Creating legal corridors for migration is of fundamental importance. That would be the source for integration without threats. We must work together on this, more cohesion, more coordination, and so as to regulate the migration flows. A sixth point is one that is just as important, which is the development of a shared culture of cooperation. And the seventh point is working together for the empowerment of women. The key word here is emancipation. An attempt of a positive agenda, therefore, that has emerged from the discussions that we have had over the last week. The Med dialogues cannot change the attitudes of governments. It's not its role, but it is made up of governments as well. It has receives the contribution from governments. So we have this possibility of promoting multilateral work together. And the governments send their representatives to these dialogues, and therefore these representatives interact with those of other countries, and joint solutions can be reached. So what is important is to coordinate the various efforts. This is something that we have tried to promote. And in my final conclusions, I need to express my thanks to all those who have worked for the realization of this conference, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, the diplomatic network, the network of consuls, the foreign embassies in Italy, and then the presidency of the Council of Ministers, the think tanks, and our partners, and the sponsors. The sponsors, in a difficult year like this, have given their contribution just the same. And then all the men and women of ISPI, the institute that I have the honor of being president of. And therefore, I pass the floor now to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, not before having also given my greetings to the President of the Council of Ministers.
Thank you very much. So this is the closing session of the 6th edition of the Rome Mediterranean Dialogues. I should like to give thanks to ISPI, the President, Massolo, and the Vice President Paolo Magri for the beautiful organization cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, the figures recorded over the last 2 weeks tell me that this has been one of the online events attended more in 24,000 participants in sessions, 3.5 million views distributed on 5 thematic fora, 15 dialogues, 11 thematic dialogues. So I should like to thank all those who connected with the Farnesina and the 100 political representatives, businessmen, representatives of civil society organizations that have provided ideas for a future of peace and prosperity to our shared sea. Now, the spread out of the COVID has clearly shown the interdependence between the countries of the enlarged Mediterranean area and have shown the shared invulnerability, which is typical of its history. I should like to share a very important result. No doubt, the health emergency has even made more urgent the need to work together and to establish better links between our countries and peoples. This pandemic has also enabled us to solve complicated issues with medicine that along the shores of the Mediterranean, from Hippocrates to Galeno, so to Averroes, started to get developed in its modern form many centuries ago. The big issues of international politics are no exception. So we have an in-depth analysis of the issues we are confronted with in the enlarged Mediterranean area and proposals for solving these issues. Let's start off with the diagnosis. So there's convergence. So there are historical factors of instability as well as direct and indirect repercussions of the health emergency. So the framework is fragile. This area is characterized by even greater polarization. This is the result of interaction between long-run crisis and internal fragmentation, competition for sovereignty on the sea and the energy resources of the sea, and alongside with hybrid threats, technologically advanced and difficult to be contained if there's no shared in contrast, and I'm referring to human trafficking, international crime, and cybercrime as well. The pandemic has partially altered the security policies introduced by the different countries, and there are difficult national priorities, and the risk being that those who think that the regional arena is going to become more and more uncertain and more susceptible to bring about international crises that are hazards for Europe. So we can see some critical fronts in the Middle East, North Africa, the Gulf area, and the Sahel. So we've heard this within the framework of MED with many colleagues who were present, representatives of the UN, of the EU, and the major international organizations. Now we need to wonder what are the replies we can provide to all these springs to avoid the conflicts and the repercussions. So the major remedies: polarization, overlapping of heterogeneous threats. These are elements that seem to point to convenience alliances and the solutions based on strength and the accomplished fact tactics. And it is even the more so when we have hydrocarbon wells in the Eastern Mediterranean. These actions that may seem to be a solution instead trigger action and retaliation, making their insecurity even greater. From this MED edition, there's a need to convey a message on which there must be a consensus. The only sustainable and durable solution for conflicts, including in the enlarged Mediterranean area, should be a political solution. So, for example, the Abraham agreements, most of the international community has accepted it as a positive contribution for stability and peace in the Middle East, but also for its prosperity and sustainability. And these are witness to the force of diplomacy as the normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab world. So we must build groundwork. So there's a need for a treatment based on a positive agenda to make the most of the potential of governance structures that have already been introduced in this area. This is the Italian strategy, starting off from the idea that the interaction between the countries of the two shores should be on an equal basis, on equal ground. Each country should be a part of the solution and not of the problem. So we want to make the most of the opportunities of economic cooperation and sustainable development to create shared in prosperity, working with and Italy, with the countries of the region. Now, the balance of our common Mediterranean space needs perseverance in dialogue and inclusive engagement. These are the very culture of our foreign policy, but we need also to develop mechanisms for the mutual benefit of sharing in resources. And for this reason, we would like to review the southern neighborhood policy of the European Union based on participating in the so-called Mediterranean common goods and to improve north-south cooperation based on the more-for-more approach. The ultimate goal is to encourage southern shore countries so that they can make a more robust contribution for the stability of the Mediterranean area, having reference with also to the phenomenon of irregular migration. On migration, we should be inflexible on the criminal dimension of the phenomenon, which is very much exploited by traffickers and human being smugglers, because the individual rights of migrants should be protected, as well as the security of national communities hosting them. As I've often repeated over the last few days, the good outcome is based on the empowerment of origin countries, transit countries, and final destination countries. There should be transparency in behaviors. Now, even if on paper a general scheme of repatriation from Europe might seem to be difficult for its concrete functioning, there's need for effective cooperation and economic development of North African and Sahelian countries. The European Union is faced with the great opportunity of refounding a migratory policy for the Mediterranean. So there should be a balance to strike with the concrete solidarity of all European members within the framework of positive incentives to develop trust and more evolved forms of economic, political, and social partnership. The Euro-Mediterranean cooperation has much to gain from this. If the European Union does not want to be a protagonist, the void of powers will be filled in by others. They are very far from our values and goals, objectives. For this reason, Italy very much wishes that with the new administration, an active policy of the U.S. in the Mediterranean is activated. Italy is more than aware that there's a need to fully support the initiatives with which the European Union intervenes within the neighborhood policy through missions and operations of the common defense and security policy of the European Union. And we support cooperation with other security providers, stability and capacity building in the region, the UN, NATO, and of course we have to strengthen the southern part and OSCE with its cooperation committees, and we are in favor of harmonizing those UN-led processes. If they are fully supported, these are the preferable and more effective solution to regional crisis from Syria to Yemen to Libya. let me focus on Libya. We very much cherish Libya, thanks to the work of the UN within the Berlin process. The Libyan people have started a pathway to the prosperity, stability, peace, but there's still much to be done, and there's a need more than ever to have the commitment of the international community because the progress made should not be undermined, starting off from the ceasefire and the oil production that has been resumed. So there must be dialogue for a general solution negotiated by the Libyans, respectful of Libyans in Libya. As for the entire enlarged Mediterranean area, the inclusive dialogue and sharing policy are the antidotes to polarization. You might object that this is a profession of faith which is difficult to put in practice. As others have answered, I repeat that the difficulty is motivation for putting efforts and putting the best of our energies and capabilities to reach the targets that we have set for ourselves. If we try to imagine concrete proposals to correct the imbalances of the enlarged Mediterranean area, so we have a twofold time frame. So we have to overcome the pandemic in terms of healthcare and in terms of recovery. 2021 is the key year. We want to make the most of the investments made for the distribution of vaccines, screening. We've been amongst the first to invoke universal access, and we are going to continue to set this goal. And we have important meetings. And I'm referring to the Italian presidency of the G20 and COP26, and Italy will be the co-president of COP26. Our ambition is that we want to see the mark of a European and Mediterranean country that is determined to make this common sea a lab of socio-economic and environmental sustainability. Then there's a second time frame within which we have to make this political and economic and social effort vis-à-vis the Mediterranean peoples, the young people, the women that have been hit most by the lockdown. It's the 2030 agenda of the UN, which remains the major framework for regional cooperation in the enlarged Mediterranean. And we want to make the most of the green and digital transitions, which are the most important revolution of the 21st century. So we are developing partnerships to support startups. And by way of conclusion, let me just spend a few words on preventing conflicts. And once again, I have a medical metaphor. How can we reach the immunization of the enlarged Mediterranean from future conflicts? How can we make peace sustainable? We still have few treatments available that might help us reach out this goal. The first is the sharing of resources. As in the economy, in international policy, the sharing notion in burdens, in resources and responsibilities will be one of the keys to get to cooperation instead of competition. And it was adopting this approach that we made encouraging results in fighting against terrorism within the framework of anti-Daesh. And there will be the ministerial hosted by Italy in Naples in 2021. The second treatment is to pay attention to the human dimension of the security, food security, physical security, and we've launched a food coalition with the FAO, and the social and economic security. So on the international arena, Italy has always made the most in order to put the human person at the very heart of policies. And in our relationships with the enlarged Mediterranean partners, so we cannot compromise. And there will always be our effort for a diplomacy of rights, which finds its implementation in the campaign for the moratorium on the death penalty, to respect civilian and political rights and the dignity of migrants. The third treatment is the importance of civil society organizations. Its promotion is one of the major pillars of the positive agenda of Italy for the Mediterranean to foster positive collaboration between the different components, social, cultural, and religious components of the peoples. Every year, thanks to MED, we see the opportunity for many young people, women, experts, businessmen, political, religious leaders to exchange, to dialogue with one another. And within this edition, which is drawing to a close, we've given the greatest attention to young people and women. And of course, we very much cherish the action of women mediators in the Mediterranean. Before handing over to the President of the Council, let me go back to the thinking of a great Moroccan writer, Fatima Mernissi, in the time suspension between modernity and past, saw the time has a wound, and over the last few months, we've seen the anxiety for what we've lost and for what is yet to come. What we've lived out through pandemic could be seen as a break in history before and after, and this might increase the wounds of our societies, but could also help us to treat them. It is up to us to make a decision on how to do and what to do, and we all, I hope, will at the height of the challenge we have to take up. So I hope we'll be able to meet in person for the next edition of the Med Dialogues next year. And this said, I should like to thank for the presence, and I should like to hand over to the President of the Council of Ministers, Giuseppe Conte. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Di Maio, President Massolo. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to greet and thank all the representatives of the institutions who are listening to us, ISPI, the private bodies that have contributed to the success of the Med Dialogues this year. And I would also like to thank Minister Di Maio and the Farnesina, who, besides confirming the commitment of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation to promote this important forum for dialogue, have succeeded in working in these very harsh conditions, very difficult conditions. I would like to recall last year and even the year before last, there were thousands of people, and the COVID has not only made it more difficult for us to be with our loved ones, but it has made things more difficult also for different countries. We are before a global emergency that requires an international coordinated response, especially in the regions characterized by great interdependence, such as Europe and the Mediterranean. The desire to confirm the Med Dialogues in this manner, that is, in a virtual meeting, well, Italy is fully aware of the needs of all this. The red thread that was present this year was the pandemic due to the coronavirus and its effect on the broader Mediterranean and the future implications. In this sense, many have considered COVID as an accelerator of the changes that are underway in the international scenario. Others described it as a sudden factor of fragility that has put to the test the resilience of our communities. These are interpretations that we can all support because each of them captures a fundamental aspect of COVID-19 and of this period that we are experiencing. But I would like to add some other remarks, and that is the extent to which COVID has exacerbated the dilemmas that politics has to cope with in its daily work of thinking and reprogramming. Now, once the pandemic is over, the risk is that it may leave a terrible legacy, deeper watersheds in society, and a lack of trust and of confidence. So we are confronted with a major challenge. This is true both for the national setting, the regional setting, and the global world. Pursuing security and sustainability and shared prosperity in the broader Mediterranean requires more than ever before a dialogue. It requires joint responsibility constantly amongst all the players. Also, in order not to lose the mutual fertilization and the history we have in common and the possibility of creating a better future together. With regard to shared prosperity and with regard to this major theme for discussion, we are all aware of the fact that this crisis has made us more vulnerable and structural risks have emerged in the process of development of all countries. The pandemic, in particular, runs the risk of having negative, long-term negative effects, not only on health, but also on food security, the well-being of the various peoples, and the stability of the more fragile countries. COVID-19 is a challenge also for the more developed European countries that today have to face a multiple crisis. It's a health, social, and economic crisis. And it is in this context that building shared prosperity in the Mediterranean can no longer be postponed. And once again, Italy has the interest, and it is entitled to presenting itself as a strategist. We are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Barcelona process, and so we need to strengthen the partnership amongst the Mediterranean countries so as to promote a large area of growth, democracy, and stability. A partnership based on a concrete program of incentives for the reform processes, the green transition, development of trade, and deeper contacts between the peoples. In the wake of this vision, Italy has always supported, as Minister Di Maio said, a European policy of true and valid neighborhood policy. And we need to pay political attention and allocated resources to be allocated also for the South. We have taken action to review the relationships with our southern neighbors and through coordination of the EU countries, in particular with Spain. Our initiative intends to go beyond the emergency by proposing a new European approach based on the joint management of the common Mediterranean assets, that is, those material and intangible resources that belong to all countries and that constitute a shared heritage for the whole area. Conservation of the marine environment, fighting against illicit trafficking and digital infrastructure, exploitation of energy potential, which is huge. And we must also have respect for the sustainable development goals of the 2030 agenda promoted by the United Nations. COVID-19 has also highlighted the need to rethink the global values, but from the standpoint of cooperation and not competitiveness. There is great economic potential that can help us exploit better the Euro-Mediterranean area, develop integration of the southern countries, and promote a fair and sustainable development of the African continent. Over and above the political implications in the Mediterranean, we cannot allow that there be a dilemma, that our well-being and the well-being of other countries be undermined. COVID has induced us to believe this, but provided that the commitment made by some should correspond to a contribution by others towards stability and security. This is a binomial that the recent terrorist attacks that have wounded Europe have brought to our attention, once again to the attention of governments and public opinion, confirming the importance of a joint effort to protect the common interest and to uproot all forms of extremism and terrorism. This is a commitment that we need to confirm at the upcoming European Council. And we have discussed a number of issues. The Mediterranean is full of faults. There is fragmentation and interconnection. The current growing polarization between a long-term crisis and drivers of competition. We are seeing new scenarios of conflicts, new forms of alliance that can be interpreted in different ways. If we think of the threat by Daesh, but there are also other variables that come into play, such as the position of Turkey, the role of Iran, the influence of China in the area. To this, we can add also the unknowns linked to the new U.S. administration. And the European Union cannot fail to take on a greater responsibility. And diplomacy is very complex, but it is necessary. We need to reopen forums for discussion and create fertile ground to avoid monopolies, geopolitical monopolies. We must bank on credibility and continuity. Italy will continue to promote an active dialogue with all the Mediterranean countries in a frank and open manner at the bilateral level and multilateral level, and at the European level, first and foremost. With regard to the European Union, we are promoting that the resources and be made available with the joint responsibility of all parties, and also NATO, paying attention to the south of the Mediterranean means being far-sighted for the future, and we need to promote a sensitivity towards the Mediterranean of the alliance. And our participation in international missions have been positive. And the UNIFIL mission in Lebanon, a country that I visited in early September, where the explosion of the Beirut port was a terrible event. And we participated with President Macron and the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres. And our presence is important also in Iran, where we have our troops in a context which is worsened by the crisis and by the attacks against Western targets. And then we have the Irini operation with regard to the embargo on weapons in Libya and peace activities in sub-Saharan Africa. So we need to be strategists. If we consider Africa, where stability is most important and concrete actions are required in a far-sighted manner, we must promote sustainable solutions. The crisis in Libya, for instance, is an example. Encouraging processes and progress which has been achieved at the security, economic and political level. We hope that this may lead to completing the roadmap set up by the Libyans themselves and renewal of national governance and reconstruction of the country without external interference. The Berlin process under the aegis of the United Nations that we support. The same holds for Syria, which continues to experience terrible instability. It is going through a humanitarian crisis, which is one of the worst of the last few years. and it cannot be overcome through a military solution. What is required is a political process. Here is where it should be led by the United Nations in Geneva and supported by the international community. The litmus paper of the politics that occurs there has an impact on Europe and on Italy. We have seen Turkey taking unilateral actions, exploiting a window of opportunity that was disclosed in October and the one in December. It is difficult to forge ahead, but we need to go ahead because it is profitable for all. Let us consider the energy dynamics in that area. Let us look at the normalization process of relationships between Israel and the Arab world. Italy and this was pointed out by Minister Di Maio, the conclusion of the Abraham Accords that are an important step towards regional stability. This is a process, however, we must acknowledge this, a process that is to support and not replace the resumption of peace talks between Israel and Palestine. These are fundamental in order to reach the two-state solution and a lasting peace in the whole of the Middle East. Another issue, migrations. This is a structural global phenomenon. The dynamics involving Europe occur in the Mediterranean, but their origin is farther away in the Sahel, where it is no chance that the contribution of Italy has increased in a significant manner. The effects of COVID on migration are manifold. I'm not referring only to the consequences of the economic crisis on the migration flows, but also the worsening of external perception. European citizens should look at migrants with with a more antagonistic approach, especially where the labor market is waning in the south. And there is also a misleading perception that is worsened by the pandemic. So we need to take action and provide global cooperation, and in particular promoting regular migration flows, preventing and fighting against irregular migrations. The new European Pact for Migration must represent an opportunity for introducing a European migration policy through a multi-level approach. The European Union must seize the opportunity of an integrated system that may take a holistic approach to the internal and external impact of the migration flows. To accomplish this objective, we must raise our ambition. This initiative, therefore, must consider the various instruments and see them as a package. I have already stated, I said it a few days ago at the Italian-Spanish meeting held in Palma de Mallorca, we take on the proposal of this meeting, which is important but insufficient because of the imbalance between responsibilities and solidarity. I recently recalled in a letter and in a non-paper that we sent together with the prime ministers of Spain, Greece, and Malta. We addressed the European Union to take action by intervening in the returns and partnership with the countries of origin and the transit countries. Civil society and culture. Now, this theme, I've left this theme to the end because I think that it is one of the most important aspects to solve the dilemmas and overcome the contrasts that I've mentioned so far. I repeat this over and over again, and it is important to emphasize it here. History, culture that unites the Mediterranean countries are unique as instruments that we have recourse to unawares. They're part of our identity. Few geographic areas in the world have the same level of contamination and cross-fertilization that we have in the Mediterranean, where there is a meeting of men, peoples, and knowledge, and this is the scenario before our eyes is that of a Mediterranean that is fragmented and divided, and with nationalisms, fundamentalisms, and institutional instability. At times, culture is considered to is seen in a distorted manner, and it defines the identities and sets up fences. But instead, it should gather us together. It should bring us together. It has a great potential, and it should give back to the Mare Nostrum the ability of being the sea of all. And to pursue this objective, we must involve the civil societies and cultural exchanges, scientific research, a field where Italy is extremely active through scientific diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, to develop a cultural spring. There is shared heritage amongst different peoples that should constantly promote dialogue. Dialogue that, in order to be credible, needs to acknowledge human rights and fundamental rights, and invest in young people, empowerment of women, and the resources of our society. I would like to conclude by pointing out that the Med Dialogues have always expressed the ambition and ability to contribute to the construction of this community made of heterogeneous realities that are capable of opening up to each other and of cooperating. The great values of this exercise lies in the people who meet here in Rome every year. The virtual solution, the online meeting has made it possible for us to come together and seems to have worked. My hope is that next year we will be able to meet in person and face to face. A hope that for our country is also a commitment. Health is a universal value. It is an objective that sees Europe and Italy in the front line. On the 21st of May 2021, we will be hosting in Rome a new health summit together with the European Commission within the framework of our presidency of the G20. The G20 has the task of promoting the relaunching of global growth. We will do this by putting at the center of our attention the human being and the environment, as pointed out by the 3 Ps that are the key factor in the discussion of the program of the G20: people, planet, prosperity. We will support this vision, turning it into an opportunity for change, also through the COP26 on climate change, that we will be chairing together with the United Kingdom. The prospects in bringing about these international initiatives owe a lot to the Mediterranean, and they will refer to the Mediterranean. For the geographic position, we are a country that has dialogue in its DNA. We know what dialogue is and what interdependence means. We are also aware of the commitment, the effort that needs to be made to promote dialogue. And we know that it is always the most fruitful, and the Mediterranean must continue to be a source, an inextinguishable source of creativity, where people may receive the light of knowledge, the grace of beauty, and the warmth of brotherhood. This latter expression is not my own. This is how the Mediterranean was described years ago by a famous Italian politician, academician, Giorgio La Pira. So after the wealth of these days of discussion and encounter, this is how I describe the Mediterranean. So thank you, and I'll see you all again in our next edition of the Med Dialogues. Thank you, Mr. Minister. and President of the Council, you have been very generous, and I'm sure that the Med community will be grateful to you for this. Thank you for having put substance and heart in these contributions you have given. I think that at this point we have come to the conclusion of our work. And so I declare that the 6th edition of the Med Dialogues is now closed. And goodbye, and see you next year. Thank you to you all. Thank you.